Hello and welcome to the Pro Series Conversations from CheckBox Pro. My name is Missy and I'm the founder of CheckBox Pro, where we help school leaders become their most efficient and effective selves by matching them with ed-focused executive assistants. Each member of our team has over 10 years of experience in the education sphere, and though we may consider ourselves pros in some areas, we can't be an expert in every area. This is why we are excited to bring folks working in the education space to offer tools, tips, and insights to make the life of a school leader even more sustainable. Today, you will hear from Ryan Dolibois, who I've known and worked with for several years now. He's kind, personable, intentional, fun, and ambitious, which makes him one of my favorite people to work with. Ryan has worked in education since 1998, where he started as an elementary school teacher in Houston, Texas through Teach for America. Following his time in the classroom, he has helped schools develop their strategic plans and capital campaigns to increase their footprint and impact within the city. In 2015, he became the executive director / superintendent of Yellowstone Schools, and in 2018, he launched an innovative school model that is the first of its kind in Texas. He now serves as the founding executive director of the Sarofim Foundation, which once fully funded will be the largest philanthropic organization in Houston. Ryan, it's so good to have you on today.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be here.
I feel like it's everybody's least favorite part of the podcast. They just sit there and they're like, I have to listen to this about myself.
And then live up to it, right? I mean, there's a lot of expectation now.
Well, I'm impressed with us because I think getting us together today only took one reschedule.
That's pretty good. Which compared to when we were doing our weekly meetings, how many reschedules you had to do on my behalf. Yeah, I'd say we're winning.
Which is so indicative of a life of a school leader. They're like, I got this fire. This fire right now has to take my attention.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, well, so to just kick us off, I want to tell our listeners like how I know you and why I brought you on today. So listeners, Ryan was a client of CheckBox Pro starting in 2020, and I directly supported him as his executive assistant. So as your EA, I got a close-up look at your leadership style, strengths and all, okay, everything. And I've worked with several leaders, and I feel like I've really learned that each one of you have truly your own superpower, right? And after having worked with you for those 3 years, yours truly was / is your ability to fundraise. But really, it's your ability to invest people in the mission of your organization, which I find just really impressive. And we even have some colleagues in common, right? Like I've got other school leaders who know you intimately, and they'll say the same thing, right? They're really impressed, but and maybe jealous at your ability to do what you do. But it's the reason I brought you on today in hopes that you can maybe impart some of that wisdom for other school leaders or maybe even nonprofit leaders who just may be struggling in that area, right? Like that's not a superpower of theirs. So before we jump into just kind of everything and kind of the tips and tricks, can you just tell us a little bit about your background, what roles you've had prior to becoming the executive director? And I say / superintendent of Yellowstone Schools, which is
so funny.
Tied to the unique model that I mentioned in your bio. So just kind of give us some framework for who you are.
Sure. So, as you said in your intro, I moved to Houston in '98. I originally grew up in Northern Virginia, DC area, and came down to Houston to be part of Teach for America. And, again, like many in that space, thought I'd stay for 2 years and then go back to the East Coast, get my, quote unquote, real job. And, a couple of things happened right out of the gate. Fell in love with Houston, fell in love with teaching, and just realized that there was so much to offer in the education space, and so many opportunities in that space that it became my passion and really, my life professionally up to and including what we're doing now. So, taught for 3 years in the near north side in Houston, 5th grade, and then moved on to Yes Prep, where I spent a decade. And really in that transition from teaching in Teach for America to Yes, was hired on at Yes to be the development director. And it was primarily based on the 5th grade fundraising, the Frito pie sales that led to our ability to go to Disney World every year. with our whole fifth grade class. Now, again, to be clear, we didn't set this up. We were just, dialing in what had been done for a number of years before, many, many good leaders ahead of us that had done this work. So, I show up on the scene at Yes Prep, having raised money through hot dog sales and Frito pie, realizing, oh, wait, what we're getting into here is a little bit different. And we'll probably talk about this more later, but my first year at Yes was 2001. I joined in August. We had just had Tropical Storm Allison in Houston. And then that was followed quickly by 9/11 and then the collapse of Enron. And my first fundraising board meeting was in October of that year. And, and the bottom had just fallen out of the Houston community, particularly in the philanthropic space. And so that was my introduction to fundraising. And I honestly, I fell in love then, and it continues to be something that really ignites me and inspires me. Stayed on at Yes for 10 years, had a brief stint at Episcopal High School, another premier high school here in Houston on the private side, and then found my way, as you mentioned, to Yellowstone, where I had just the distinct privilege of being for 8 years before, I'm in this now new role at the Sarofim Foundation.
Frito pie sales.
Frito pie sales started it all. So, it was, and there, not having grown up in Houston, I learned a lot about the correct way to make the Frito pie too. It's got to stay in the bag. There's a specific kind of chili you use. Anyway, we can do that for another episode.
I was about to say a different, that's a bonus episode. Be on the lookout.
Right. That's right.
Okay. So before we jump in too much more, I need to get clarification on a few definitions in this specific development fundraising space.
Sure.
So you mentioned development, you hear obviously fundraising, and then I've seen people who call it advancement. Yeah. What's the difference between those terms or overlap between those terms when we're thinking about advancement, development, and fundraising? Sure.
No, that's a great question. So, and I kind of have encountered these terms, interchangeably and somewhat personally through my own journey. Advancement is really the larger word to describe stuff that includes fundraising, communications, alumni relations, strategy. You'll often find this in higher ed. You might find it in hospital systems, certainly in school districts or in schools where you have a role that is more than just specifically fundraising, right? I prefer that term because I think advancement is actually what any good fundraiser is doing, which is advancing the mission of the organization. And I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about what that model might look like and that staffing. Development is really a more, usually falls under the umbrella of advancement. So you might have an advancement office that includes a development department, right? And that's really referring more to the specific, nitty gritty of fundraising itself, right? You rarely find the word fundraising, in somebody's title, chief fundraiser or something, right? And primarily that's because, for anybody that's really doing this work, the raising, the actual raising of the funds is just a part of, what it actually takes to do a development office or an advancement office. And I'm sure, through the course of this, we'll probably talk a little bit more about that.
Perfect. Okay. That's helpful because I was like, are these synonyms?
Yeah, they can be, and again, I would just say I would caution because there is a different role for advancement versus development, right, in an organization. Yeah. And so, and again, depending on who's listening to this and where they are, you really want to, generally you want to think about your fundraising in the context of advancement, right? And I think you'll find that the organizations are the most successful is when they're deploying their fundraiser or their development team for more than just the specific act of fundraising. But anyway, I do think that it's an important distinction. Advancement really highlights what's actually happening in that part of the office, which is advancing, the mission of the organization and hopefully advancing the dreams of the donor as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think we will get into that. And I'm sure it's tied to a big part of your work, which was the strategic planning piece, right?
Sure.
Yes. Okay. So we'll put a pin in that. I think we'll come back to it.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, so the nitty gritty of our, we'll get into that right now. And I want to stick with your time just as a school leader for a bit before we talk, about your new role and the kind of transition process there. So yeah, so you worked for 8 years as the executive director, superintendent. Maybe because so people are like, why
Sure.
does she keep saying executive director slash superintendent? Maybe
Yes.
tell us about the unique model that is Yellowstone schools in the Houston area.
Sure. So, Yellowstone had actually been around for over a decade when I first joined as the executive director. So, Yellowstone was founded in 2002 as Yellowstone Academy, which was a private faith-based school in Houston's Third Ward. I joined, as the executive director in 2015. We were a pre-K 3 through eighth grade model, serving about 300 students, about 6 blocks from central downtown Houston. And we discovered through just the success we were having as a model that we both wanted to serve more students and we wanted to go all the way through high school. But the model that we had, as a private faith-based school, really didn't allow for that kind of growth. The students we were serving were coming primarily from the communities directly around downtown Houston. We were fundraising for both the tuition and most of the operating expenses for the school, and we had all this success. Our alumni were going off and doing great things, and we were trying to figure out what's a way that we could grow this while remaining sustainable and continuing to attract top talent and everything else. And so one of the things we looked at was the ability to basically have two schools operate on one campus. And we, looked at all kinds of different models around the country, talked to legal counsel, looked at what was going on in the charter space, and determined that there was a way that we could essentially maintain the private school feel and environment that we had in our pre-K 3 through fifth grade as a private school, and at the same time apply and eventually got a charter that we could operate from sixth going all the way to 12th grade. And so essentially what was born out of that was Yellowstone Schools, two distinct 501c3s, two distinct boards, which again, I think we'll probably get into.
Yeah.
And that's why we were so fortunate to have Missy and CheckBox Pro Services working with us, right? But then operating on one campus so that the students we were serving had access to pre-K 3 through 12th grade program that would be premier, in the heart of the city and really provide, for their and their families' needs. And so, again, I think it's important to say here, we were the first of its kind in the state of Texas, in part just because the work's really hard, and you sacrifice a lot in that model. It still requires this, pretty substantial fundraising lift for that private school. You end up making it possible for the charter to receive a lot of benefits from the state side that would not get otherwise, right? Because it can really only flow that way. We can't be using state dollars to prop up any kind of private, education or anything like that. And so, but what we found is that what it created was a more fulfilling and rich experience for the students and the families that got to be part of that model.
Very neat. Yeah. Yeah. It is the more I work, because obviously I'm still working with
Right.
Yellowstone schools, and every year I'm like, it's like that
Yeah.
emoji with the swirly eyes. Like I feel like that emoji with the swirly eyes, but I'm like, hold on, wait. So where does this need to be coded? Like who does this go to?
That's
And
right.
y'all do a great job of like being just really good stewards of those dollars, and obviously really ethical, but
Yes.
it takes
It's a lot.
of
It's a lot.
intentionality to do it.
It's a lot. Yep.
Well, yeah, and so and you mentioned, right, like yeah, that because both models really do rely on that fundraising piece of things. And then of course your entire like advancement department has a whole different challenge, because now it is like, well, we're one, but we're separate. Like and kind of
Right.
where your kids are kind of coming in dictates how and what you're communicating, and just and where you're finding those kids. And but in order to I would imagine, and I think a big part of what you did when you came in was that strategic planning process.
Yes.
Like to be able to say, okay, this is what we're going to do, is we need to be this two schools under one umbrella, aligned mission and vision, yet have clear separation of, fiscal
Right.
responsibilities and
Right.
red tape for testing and all of those things, right? Like that is different.
Yep.
You have to be strategic and you have to go in with a plan. And so, and you got a little bit of that strategic planning experience with your role at Yes Prep. Is that correct? Like, did you do
Absolutely. Yes. No. Yeah. And I think, it was interesting just kind of, reflecting and preparing for our time together, thinking about the distinction between fundraising and strategic planning, right? And I think, the first thing would just be to say that I think these are all part of the same circle, right? It's essentially what you're doing in strategic planning typically is you are starting with, and again, we'll probably want to talk about this more, who you are as an organization, what you're trying to achieve. And in doing that, you're often thinking about what are the resources that you can bring to bear towards that larger mission. And inevitably, when you're doing that, you're also talking about, the lack of resources or the parameters of the resources that you have to accomplish whatever it is that you're after. And pretty quickly thereafter, you start thinking about how you can get additional resources to bring them to bear. What are your revenue? How is it that you can, actually pay for what it is that you want to go do? And so you find very quickly that fundraising and strategy, you become part of the same larger conversation that you need to have as an organization, how you staff your model and everything else. Anyway, and so I think for me, the Yellowstone experience specifically was really a culmination of many years of working in places like Yes Prep and even at Episcopal too, where you're every year setting the parameters around what you want to accomplish, what your outcomes are, what your larger vision is, and then figuring out in the fundraising context how you're going to pay for it and bring it and make it a reality.
Is the strategic planning process done each year? Or what's the timeline?
Yeah, I mean, I think
plan.
So I learned a lot about this. I mean, I think you're typically, when you're thinking about real strategic planning, I would say that's more when you're talking about like a 3 to 5 year vision, right? So you have your larger mission vision for the organization, your operating values, those kinds of things that are, really evergreen and aren't changing. But then you're typically setting aside, okay, this is what we're going to accomplish over the next 3 to 5 years. And then every year you're determining what your, outcomes and goals are for that specific year against that larger strategic plan, right? And so I think what becomes interesting around that, and again, we can talk about this in whatever detail you want to. What I find about the strategic plan and what was really challenging, particularly in the school environment, is you have so much stuff coming at you that you're typically reacting to your current environment. Where really the strategic plan is supposed to be something that lives, over that. It's a much larger context and scope for what you're trying to do. And then your operating plan is really how you're encountering the obstacles that you're facing in service of that larger strategic vision, right? And so, but what I think we find in strategic planning and what happens often is we go too quickly to the how, and we kind of forget the what and the why, and maybe even a little bit the who, right? If that makes sense. So, hey, we know we need to do this, this, and this in order for our kids to get here, right? We're going to call that a strategic plan. Well, really, that's just one of the operating pieces of what you're doing. Whereas the strategic plan is, hey, who are we going to be? What's our differentiation in this space? What's going to be important that we want to have as an impact for the city or community that we're serving in a much broader context.
So for our listeners, like you now serve, we know you're no longer at Yellowstone,
right,
but you're still serving on the board there and in a very intentional way. Tell us a little bit about like the board's involvement in that strategic planning process, or like, who are you involving? Maybe just tell us a little bit about what strategy or tactics that you embark on when you're trying to, we need to start the strategic planning process. And
that's a great question. So, I was so fortunate when I was in that role at Yellowstone. In many ways, it felt like, getting an MBA. The board chairs that we had and the board members were just of such a high caliber. And I learned so much from them, and they were so generous with their, the classic time, talent, and treasure there, that it really was just a master class. And one of the things that I learned probably early on was that distinction between, as one of the board members put, kind of strategy and operations, right? And that the board's role is to really live at the strategic level, to make sure that the vision for the organization is actually coming to fruition. And as much as possible, make a distinction between that and the daily operations of the school, where they really should not be involved, right? And And that's hard because you have typically on a board go-getters, you have people that want it to go well. They're obviously impassioned about the mission, and so they're going to find any way they can to volunteer and be involved. And yet at the same time, you want to make sure that you create the space for the paid staff, particularly in the executive director and their leadership team, to be able to operate successfully. And so, I think that conversation between what is strategy and the role that the board is supposed to play there versus what is really operations, and making sure that that doesn't bleed over into your board meeting or into the board actions is really part of the tension and conversation that's super important between the executive director and his or her board. And once we got comfortable with that language, we would actually find ourselves in board meetings talking about that, and it might be a board member that would say, "Hey, guys, this is an operations question, not a board question. Let's move on." And so I found that exceedingly helpful. I also found it helpful when they could say, "Hey, Ryan, this is actually a strategic conversation. This needs to be at the board level. You need the kind of the view or perspective of board members, speaking into this, and not just assume that the staff members have it all figured out." And so I think that tug and that kind of push and pull on that is one of the critical functions that a board plays, particularly with their executive director.
Yeah. Yeah. And y'all really, yeah. Shout out to y'all's board, because you're right. Like, they have a wealth of experience, a wealth of passion. I mean, it's really
Yes.
so evident. And I mean, that could be literally a whole other
Yes.
episode of just like, how do you strategically like get your board and get the right people in that are,
Yes.
like you said, to add that perspective, because you can get so tunnel visioned, and our industry is great, but we only know what
Yeah.
we know, right? And so it's nice when you
Right.
have a business person coming in, or you have a lawyer coming in, or you have
Yes.
somebody in facilities or project management, or all these other different areas that are coming in saying like, why have y'all not
Right.
thought about this? Or just like from an outsider's perspective who does not understand education, how can we like communicate what we're doing to somebody who has
Yes.
zero background in education, that it's accessible to them? So, but again, that's a
that can
conversation.
that can be for another time. But no, I do think, I mean, to your point, and then we can get back to the main stuff here. Look at a successful organization, and seriously, the board is there, right? If and I would argue that it is really, really hard to have a successful organization despite your board, right? I mean, it literally, those two go hand in hand. And I think particularly in the education space, I found, and maybe in nonprofit work in general, depending on the leader, particularly if they're an entrepreneur and they're really excited and they're passionate about it and this is their baby and everything else, there can be this sense of hesitancy around really giving some of that control over to the board, or really seeing the board as a trusted partner. And that's really to their detriment. I mean, I think, the most successful organizations out there, particularly in the nonprofit space, are ones that are managed and run by really, really effective boards that are working in concert with that executive director, and everybody understands their roles and responsibilities. So anyway, happy to dive into that more. But I think that will be a lot of what we want to talk about with the fundraising, because I think that's really where, the board and the executive director, again, if you want to have a successful organization, are going to find themselves spending a ton of time.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's transition, because I think I could also stay on strategic planning forever. Because it's hard. There's so much nuance. But you're again, going back to your superpower is kind of that fundraising piece, which I think is just unique. So, okay, so let's just take a little bit of time to, we're gonna transition to your transition. All right. So
Sure.
tell us a little bit about your journey from being a school leader to ultimately becoming now the executive director of the Sarofim Foundation, and just what maybe inspired this transition for you personally.
Sure. Well, I mean, at the outset, it was certainly something that I wasn't necessarily looking for. I mean, I was super excited about my role at Yellowstone. As I said, we have this incredible board, incredible staff, had brought on some new leaders that were doing amazing work. And, I mean, I hadn't updated my resume for nearly a decade at the point at which a headhunter came calling about this opportunity with the foundation. And and I could say, maybe even approached the opportunity at the foundation a little bit begrudgingly at first, just because I just saw the work on the ground being so critical at Yellowstone. And we were just a really fun part where we had just finished a big capital campaign and we're opening high school. And, it felt like we were going to get to maybe eat a little bit of dessert here as we were, moving forward after 8 very difficult years. Anyway, but in exploring this more and then going through the process, I was so struck by the people and the mission of this foundation and the folks involved with it. And then also, as you said at the outset of this call, the opportunity that this presented for the city of Houston and beyond, through the creation of this new foundation. And, in many ways saw the opportunity there as a continuation of the real why behind a place like Yellowstone, which is to see people thrive and see cities flourish, and the opportunity to do that, through the Sarofim Foundation and be good stewards of, the legacy of Mr. Sarofim and serve the board in a meaningful way was, quite an honor and privilege that I was excited to undertake. So, that's where we find ourselves now. I think there's a lot we can talk about that, particularly around the fundraising. And again, I think it all comes back to this idea of impact and this ability to just have a very clear strategic vision, and then to go, and execute on that with just great people and an inspiring mission.
Yeah. It does not surprise me one bit why you embarked on that. Just thinking about the fact that you have been in Houston since 98.
Right.
You truly do have a heart for the city now. And
Yes.
what an interesting, obviously Yellowstone is great, and it's so intentional about the community in which it was created to serve. And
Yes.
but from somebody who's again, a little bit obsessed with Houston, this is a great way in which for you to see and impact potentially the other areas of that city that are doing great work and need to be
Yes.
lifted up as well. So okay, so yeah, you're just shy of a year of this new role of going, which
Yes.
this is part of why I'm also so interested in talking to you, because you have gone now from being a fundraiser
for a long time.
Yes.
Yes.
You get to go from being the person who is can you give me some money to support this program? Can you buy my Frito pie, please? Right? To being in a position of, potentially giving. And I think y'all are still very, like I said, y'all are very early in y'all's foundation.
Yes.
So, so we're not going to get into that today so much, but just you've gotten a glimpse now of being on both sides, which is kind of unique. People don't get that opportunity very often to get to really truly live on the other side of the fence, to see that greener grass or not. So again, now that you're on the giving side, how does this perspective, right, differ from being on the receiving end?
Sure.
To now potentially being on the giving side, and how does that inform your approach, if at all?
No, that's a good question. And I was thinking about this a lot because I knew you were going to ask it. How do we kind of take this all in? I think, candidly, the first thing for me was just beginning to understand what was like to your point, where I was out pursuing everyone, and having to do the approach to now people pursuing and doing the approach this way. Right. And so that's taken some adjustment. And I think it's made me appreciate even more the art of fundraising, the folks that are really dedicated to this work in the advancement space. It's a difficult job, right? And yet one that is so rewarding when you get to connect a donor's dreams or donor's intent with, this just precious mission of your organization. I just continue to get inspired by that, that handshake, across the aisle, as it were, between those two groups. And I think, what all of this has done, I love having a grantee perspective coming into this role, and also having the opportunity to now, with a little bit more bandwidth, go out and talk to other, fundraisers, both fundraisers and philanthropic organizations, other foundations, both in Houston and even, on a broader scale, and just seeing, I think the thing that I've been struck most by is just the incredible work that's being done across so many different sectors, really, again, with that central mission, not too dissimilarly from Yellowstone's mission, to just see, families, people, flourish, right? I mean, that's ultimately why we're doing all this, for folks to really realize their God-given potential. And, despite whatever barriers or obstacles that they have encountered along the way, how can philanthropy, how can really good nonprofits, open those doors to opportunity? And so in many ways, this has been a very validating year to just see that, wow, there are really good people doing really, really good work. I think it's also been a little intimidating to see that, and the problems that we face and encounter in this space are very real. That the obstacles in front of families, generational poverty, these are things that feel very intractable. It's going to take a lot of effort, and as much as we're going to be a large player on the scene, right? I mean, even the largest foundation is a small piece of the larger solution as it relates to what has to happen at every level of our society, be it churches, government, community, neighborhood, friends, family, et cetera. And so I would say, it will be fun to see this continue to play out, particularly in a way that we can set up what we're doing at the foundation to really build off the lessons and the network that I've gotten to experience over the last 25 years, in this philanthropic space. Hopefully that answers what you were getting at there. I mean, I'm sure we could spend more time just talking about what we've encountered, but we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah. So what are the lessons? Like, so if you've got a new green person coming to the
Yeah,
fundraising space or the advancement space, and you can put on whichever hat. You can put on your hat of like, I've been there, done that, or you can put on the hat of like somebody who's now on the, the
right,
giving side of things of like, hey, here's, and not, speaking specifically to the Sarofim Foundation of like the
sure,
specifics of what you're giving to, but it's just the approach or what you're looking for as far as communicating that, like that person communicating their mission in a way that
sure,
is like, because again, going back to like part of your superpower is your ability to invest people in the mission of the organizations in which you've worked for,
yeah,
right? You can get the dollars, but that's only because people believe in the work that y'all are
right,
doing. So somebody who's like, especially, it's so frustrating because again, I'm sorry, I'm getting on a little bit of horse, but it's like you've got these leaders who are doing great work. They're doing
right,
great work. And it's
right,
like, why are you struggling? Why are you struggling getting your story out there? Like getting
right.
the work that you're doing out there. What's the barrier? So what kind of advice would you have for those people who are
Oh my
struggling right
gosh.
now?
Missy, such a loaded question. So many different ways we can go with this. So, I would start with just some of the advice that I was given when I was first getting into this space, right? I mean, at the heart of this, it is what differentiates your organization. What is it about you as a leader? What differentiates your organization? And whatever it is that you do the best, right? That's what you need to keep top of mind, particularly as you're communicating it to others. And then the passion kind of comes out of that. And I think, I find with folks that are in the nonprofit space, myself included, right? We're so down in the weeds on this that a lot of times it becomes really hard for us to articulate our elevator pitch around what we're doing, and then be really intentional about what the ask is, right? And again, we could talk more about those techniques specifically if we want. What I find is that the person that is super passionate about what they're doing is very intentional about their messaging, and then is very intentional about the role that they need to play inside of fundraising, inside of their organization. That's where you start to have real success. So there's a couple things I would say, and then and what I was thinking about and what became interesting is that this actually translates, I think, to both sides of the aisle, right? Whether you're doing the fundraising or you're giving out the funds. But I mean, I think for that executive director specifically, that superintendent, that school leader, the first thing is they just need to recognize that part of their job is to fundraise, right? Just flat out. let's not fight this. Like you were hired in part to be an externally facing part of your organization, and the quicker you can kind of come to that realization, I think the more success that you can have. And if that's something, it's okay for that to be scary, but for that to be just something that like you're only going to do when you absolutely have to, or you're going to react to it in the circumstance, you are really jeopardizing the ultimate opportunity for your organization to be successful. I think the second thing, and this would apply to both sides of the aisle, but your board is your secret weapon, right? At the end of the day, if you're on the nonprofit side, your board is really your link to the community where you're going to find the dollars for your organization, where you're going to find the strategic wisdom, where you're going to find just the organizational prowess that you need to be successful. Likewise on the grant making side, right? Your board are the ones that are, carrying the legacy forward of the organization. At the end of the day, as the executive director, you serve at the, for the board. That's what we're here to do. I like it when I hear foundation executives say, "Look, it's not my money," right? Because it's not. We are truly there to be good stewards of the legacy and the work that's come before us. And so, keeping that perspective, I think, is important. But for that nonprofit leader, the board's the secret weapon. You have to have a good relationship with your board. You have to be intentional about that, and it's going to require time and intentionality on both the part of the executive director and, I think, setting that expectation for the board members as well. They're going to be on the board. They're there in part to do some fundraising, full stop. And if they're not comfortable doing that, then they're probably not right for your board, because you want them to be passionate enough about the organization that not only are they giving of their own time, talent, and treasure, but they're encouraging their friends to do the same. And then the final thing I would say on this, this might even be the way that you and I met or got connected, is that like every meeting has value, and I know this is hard because for a nonprofit leader, one of your few limited resources is actually time, right? That's one of your, there's only so many hours in a day. There's so many things you have coming at you. But I think over the last 25 years, part of what got me the opportunity to even have these kinds of dialogues is just recognizing that in every interaction and every exchange, whether that's with a parent or with a potential donor or a board member or a vendor, there's usually something out of that that advances the mission forward. And so rather than seeing that as a burden, seeing that as like an opportunity to like put another little piece of the puzzle together, it's unbelievable to me how often a seemingly innocuous meeting or something that didn't seem like it had importance, I'm rolling my eyes going into it, later connects the dot in some really strategic way for the organization. And so, if you go into the role knowing that a certain number of hours a week, I'm just going to be in this fundraising space, that doesn't mean you're actually asking for money during all those times, but it does mean that you're during those meetings and in those engagements, thinking about how just being in the community could benefit your organization long term.
Yeah. Listeners, we had to work really hard with Ryan to get him to sit at his desk.
That's right. Still hard.
Answer some email or to,
That's exactly right.
To actually
That's exactly right.
Missy, I just want to be with the people. And I'm like, that's
right.
really great. But we
however,
prep these things for this.
I can't say that that's changed a whole lot. But again, like particularly in education, this is a people business, right? I mean, the time we're spending behind our desk, yes, there are periods where that's really important. And again, different in the foundation role. But as the leader of the organization, and again, when you have CheckBox Pro and you have good time management, where you can set aside this time for strategic thinking and emails, but the rest of that time really should be out, engaging a wide spectrum of stakeholders, not just your teachers, not just your parents, but certainly the community at large as well.
Yeah, you've brought a different perspective, but again, it goes back to the people, because some of the folks I've interviewed, and they're still in that school leader role, or they're coaching, in the coaching role, and every single one of them is like, be in classrooms, right? Like, be close to the work, be back to where you're kind of reminded where and why you're doing this. And yeah, to your point, like if you find yourself behind your desk too much, you really do lose sight of
Right.
who this all is for and and being responsive, right? Like having that parent meeting is, you know, some
Yeah,
words might be exchanged and they're not always positive, but it is, like you said, it does have value and it is giving you information that you're able to
that's
then
right.
go, I'm seeing trends, or and now we
Yep.
need to kind of be responsive to the community that we have and that we're here to serve. So
And I would just say, Missy, and you found this to be true, and we've talked about this before. So many of the folks, particularly in the kind of charter school space, come into these roles because of their just incredible expertise, academically, programmatically in the classroom, right? They're most comfortable kind of in that kind of education leadership position, right? When you're the superintendent or the executive director, you are hiring the people that should be doing a lot of that work. And now your role has to be expanded to include stakeholder groups that very often, and many of my peers found very uncomfortable, whether
yeah,
that's the community space, the vendor space, the board space. And yet, I think the superintendents that have been the most successful are the ones that are able to successfully navigate that transition and see their role more now as not necessarily externally facing because they're still serving their internal constituent groups, but recognize the importance of their engagement with the external community as well, and actively seek that out, see that as part of their weekly calendar, not just as a burden that they have to do, the week before a board meeting.
yeah, yeah. I don't want to get in the weeds too much, but I think you probably have some small nuggets of, in the yeah, I love your bullet points, like these broad, like overview of like kind of like your job is to fundraise, your board is your secret weapon, and every meeting has value. Like
Yeah.
those are so great. But I wonder if we could drill down just a little bit and just spend like, what are some ways that school leaders, again, going back to like, this is not their superpower, right? Like they don't have
Right.
any experience, right? They come really from
Right.
more of an academic side. Like you kind of entered in
Yep.
with
I
from a
did. Yeah.
strategic and
Yeah.
development side. A lot of leaders are coming in of like they were strong academic leaders. And so that was a
Right.
world they didn't touch. What are some like really practical ways that they can sharpen those skills or those tools so that they can effectively do that? And again, in small ways, right? Like
Sure.
I can't take
No,
on
no,
a
no,
goal.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, the first, and this was so important to me, from my earliest time in fundraising and everything else, is, you find a mentor, right? You have to do that. And that's again why your board is so important because more than likely that's going to be the connection to somebody in the community that's going to help you. But, I was so intentional about that, reaching out to people, having a couple of meetings, and then being like, and then asking them directly, hey, would you be willing to get together with me, on some regular cadence where I can just come and bring some stuff to you and you can just kind of share your wisdom with me? And people are thrilled to do that. I mean, it brings them so much joy, so much purpose, but yet we are all often so, and maybe sometimes it's pride, but a lot of it's just like, oh man, if I ask, they're going to feel so, they can't wait for you to ask that question.
Yeah.
Right. And so, it's super important, I think, particularly in this space around the fundraising and the networking and the community engagement. There are just experts all over the place, particularly those that are going to be drawn to your board. So finding a mentor too is really important. I think I would be a little judicious about the conferences. There are conferences that are really good. I think, when you're going to the conference, what you're really doing there is practicing your networking, right? The sessions are going to be helpful, but what's really going to be helpful is you figuring out how to approach somebody with your business card. Have the have the intro conversation and the elevator pitch ready to go, and then know what it is that you're asking for. Like doing that and just practicing that and being intentional about that is as important as whatever you're going to actually get from the session itself. The final thing I would say in this is, as dumb as this sounds, is like I was thinking of, like, read the paper. I was thinking about this a lot. Um, we are in this day and age, and maybe I just sound, like an old fuddy-duddy here, in the era of Facebook, Instagram news, Twitter, TikTok, right? Where everything is just so specialized to your specific concern, your content, or,
Yeah.
your leaning,
Algorithm, yeah.
right? Like just reading the paper, particularly, in the city with which where you live, right? Even if it's
Yeah.
just the headlines, I've learned so much, just being intentional about that. The people, the players, the topics, the issues, the slant of the political landscape. What are the projects going on in the nonprofit space? 10 minutes a day in that. And I feel like I'm so much better equipped to go out in the community, actually be interesting to talk to, hopefully, and, actually begin to know some of the players and people that are going to benefit my organization.
I never would have thought that.
Yeah. Again, easy in a big city like Houston and all of that. But think about what's lost, right? When all you're doing is reading your curated list on Instagram or whatever, or on Twitter, or X or whatever it's called now. Obviously, I don't even have these things. The Facebook. Yeah. I mean, I just, that's not the day-to-day work. That's where you're just going to get your opinions validated. Like the day-to-day work is happening, on the ground in these nonprofits, in the people that are moving, transitioning in jobs, the press conferences are going on in that space. I just think that there's huge value in that, particularly as a leader of an organization, to be caught up and to know what's really going on in that space.
I love that. That's such a great little tip.
It's so old school too. I mean, come on.
I actually think Amy was like, yeah. Ryan said I need to check out the paper there was like some article that I needed to. I was like,
yeah. Yeah, it's pretty funny. And again, it's that localized feed, right? And you just don't get that. Yeah. You don't get that in in this kind of modern social media environment.
No, it's just another level of investment. It's great.
Yes.
Okay, we're wrapping up and we're getting close to the end.
Yes.
Tell me maybe, and you might have none, are there any common misconceptions or mistakes that people make when fundraising or even strategic planning? I'm sure.
Oh man, I've made all of them. I come from a wealth of experience in all the ways not to do these things. No, a couple of things. I think on the executive director side, again, just as a fundraiser myself, the plea for this part of the industry is to understand that fundraisers play a critical role in an organization. I think there can be, particularly in the education space, a lot of a kind of sense of us versus them. Oh, these people are out there, they're hobnobbing with all the well-to-do, and we're here on the ground, like really doing the hard work, right? That is absolutely true, right? The mission of the work is truly, at the school level in the classroom, like make no mistake about it, right? Yeah. And yet that fundraiser, if they're really good, is going to play a significant role in the strategy of the organization and really help you be able to make that classroom experience the best that it can be, right? So figure out how to bring that fundraiser into that conversation, have them be part of the strategy. If they're really good and you're really good, that's going to be just a critical relationship that's going to help you be successful. And that, and they're at their best when they're not, and they're not behind their desk. You don't see them for a couple of days because they're out in the community, they're doing that work, right, on your behalf and whatnot. And so I do think the executive director can play a critical role in kind of breaking down that kind of us versus them, who's doing the real work, who's doing the hard work, and who's, just eliminate that conversation and understand the possibility that exists, when advancement is really seen as part of the strategy and operations of the organization. So, and again, by the way, I say that not because I've ever been on the other side of that. From the get-go, I've had leaders that have really understood that and have embraced that and have led me down that path. So that would be one thing. I think the other thing is getting intimidated by fundraising. Like I talk to people on probably a weekly basis, like, oh, I'll do it. But I can't ask people for money. And I'm like, no, but you do all the time. You don't include the dollar amount, right? You're constantly out there when you're leading an organization. You are selling your product, right? You just don't know that you're doing it because you have this very narrowly defined way of thinking about fundraising. When in fact, from the moment you are the founder or the leader of that organization, when you open your mouth talking about that organization in some way, you are fundraising, right? You just, And so I think like embrace that and don't be worried about the actual science of the asking someone for money. I think we get so intimidated by that that we miss the larger point that the money is not the end goal. The end goal is that your organization, is successful and has the resources it needs to, fulfill its mission, right? And that's going to happen through relationships, through resources, through cold hard cash, through, building contracts, through all kinds of innovation that you're going to come through conversations and conferences, right? Like there's this whole host of things under that advancement umbrella, that you want to consider as you're doing that. And then the final thing I would say is that, you know, the true act of actual fundraising is not dissimilar from other kinds of relationships that you have, right? And I've seen it both ways. If you are getting to know somebody, like, however you go about that is also the way you want to go about, beginning to have a conversation with someone around how you can unlock, their generosity towards your organization, right? And so it very often doesn't happen in the first meeting. It might be the second or the third, right? And when you do it in a gentle and a kind way, and you do it in a way that is humble and in a way that, honors that person's time and their resources and their interest in your organization. But what I would also say is make no mistake about it. When you're in a nonprofit space and you're meeting with somebody from the community, they know why you're there. So don't be intimidated. Actually engage in that work, be a leader in that space, because at the end of the day, the fundraising professional and the nonprofit leader are the only ones in the organization. There's nobody else in the organization that can do that work, right? There's a lot of people that can be in the classroom and support the students. There's a lot of folks that can do other things, but it really is the executive director and that chief fundraiser that are the ones that are out there doing this work around fundraising. So like embrace that role. Don't be shy, and get after it, because that's what the community is expecting you to be doing.
That's great. I did not do Girl Scouts growing up because I had to sell some cookies.
Yes, that's right.
The most famous cookies in the whole wide world. And I was like,
right.
no, I can't do it. I can't hear no.
Right.
That's an
Oh my
affront.
gosh. Yeah, no. Yeah. No, that's the whole point, right? I mean, and again, like, who isn't excited to have somebody come and ask them for Girl Scout cookies? I've never met somebody that's like, oh my gosh, I roll. What is this?
No, they're usually sad that they don't have the money to buy them.
Exactly, right? And I just, again, why do we think that'd be any different? When you gain an audience with somebody and you're passionate about your mission and you have something really good to share about the work you're doing, right? I mean, it's the same thing, but I just think, that requires a certain level of humility and a certain, level of risk. And like you said, and what's the worst thing that's going to happen? They're going to tell you no. I mean, I get rejected all the time, and it's just fine. That's not where I'm placing my identity anyway. And so, I just wonder how many opportunities have been squandered, how many, leaders have not, really fulfilled the full potential of their organization, because of these conversations are had about some of the things we've been talking about today. And that's a shame. Our city needs those folks to be, really successful in order for us to, accomplish all we can for what we're after here.
And there's lots of people out there looking to invest,
That's right. Oh, that's right.
They want to give, they just don't always know where or
Yes.
how. And so
that's exactly right. That's our job.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for
right.
asking.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got two final questions for you.
Okay.
So, my company exists to make the work of a school leader sustainable.
Yes.
Hard, right. Those school leaders, not your title anymore. It was for 25
Right.
years in the education space, and you managed to make it sustainable for yourself. You've got a family, you got 3 kids that are in lots of activities, and y'all are busy and fun, and you go to concerts, and you really are and have managed to find balance for those last 25 years. And maybe again, it ebbs and flows, but what would be some quick advice for how you manage to do that for yourself?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously the first thing is having Checkbox Pro,
Ah,
as you're on your team, right? Yeah,
not leading
having that
question.
good calendar management. I'm sure that's what you were asking and teeing
Yeah,
it up
that's
that way.
exactly
No, I
what.
mean, it's
Mhm.
so funny. I mean, I think the first lesson about that really came during my first summer of teaching in Teach for America, on site, right? You would come over the summer and you would get assigned to a summer school classroom, and it was
Oh,
me and three other high functioning college students that had never failed at anything. And here we are, we're thrown in with like 24th graders, and I just saw these folks staying up every night, all night. I was doing the same thing. There was all this pressure to make it perfect and do all this stuff. And by about the fourth day, we were all burned out. Everybody was experiencing failure for the first time really in their life, right? And you just started watching some of them just kind of fall off, right? And it was about that time I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to go to the movies, and went for a couple hours to the movies and came back and was like, this is kind of amazing. I'm a little recharged here. And now what I'm giving to my students is a little bit more of who I actually am because,
mm,
I've had the opportunity to step back for a second and kind of take this in the context of everything else. Right. And I think, I've always worked really hard and been very driven and had many late nights and early mornings. And, the work has been so motivating. I've been so blessed to be in a career that, also engages just, who I am and what I want to be. But I do think that there's something around like, you have to be able to bring your best self. And in doing that, what I find with the employees that have done the best work is those that have a family and, are engaged in things beyond just the work, right? And have an identity, in that context. And I mean, again, I'm certainly a person of faith, and this concept of the Sabbath, I think it's baked in. You need that break, and if you
yeah.
can get away and you can have that scheduled, and it doesn't need to be excessive and it doesn't need to be all the time, but that, man, that once a week where you are really stepping back and saying, hey, I'm not going to do this work for, this length of time, and it will be there tomorrow or it will be there later tonight. You will find, if you can create that discipline around it, that you come back recharged, and, the work will always be there. There's never a point where you get it all done. I mean, I've tried. I really thought I can do it, and it's impossible. And so, once I reframe that in a context that prioritize that period of rest, for at least, just a day a week or an afternoon a week, if that's what it was, that I think allowed me to show up in a different way.
Mm.
But I do think that that's important. And again, I think, particularly for those leaders at the top, the organization needs you healthy, right? They need you in a context where,
Yeah.
you're coming with, interesting things that you're doing and experiencing, right, in order for you to really be somebody that they can connect to.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not a huge like wellness, balanced. I mean, it's not balanced,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's an integrated, it's
Yeah.
an understanding of how I can come to this space, and show up every day, in a way that's going to contribute to the work that we're doing.
Yeah. Love that. Love that. Okay. Um, one final question as we wrap up.
Yes.
And in the spirit of my company's name, what is one box, big or small, that you hope to check off today?
Ooh, today?
Today, I
Well,
know.
I mean, it was like trying to have a successful, podcast with you. That was like a
Check.
primary. So now we can check that. Successful remains to be seen, but it is done either way. Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, I was really looking forward to this time with you. So I would say that that's like getting to the other side of this is really fun.
Check.
So why don't we go with that for now? I could probably think of
Um,
some others too, but none of them are nearly as interesting as this. So there we go.
Great. Wonderful. All right. Well, okay, as we wrap up, I just want to again say to our listeners that, schools we know, or as you've learned now, right? Like they're not fundraising to stockpile money for a rainy day or to have these
That's right.
flashy amenities, right? Like y'all are fundraising to ensure that y'all can continue to provide the supportive and rigorous programs that those schools believe are truly what are best for students that they serve, right? And just what a
Yes.
beautiful mission it is to just be able to support that. So, Ryan, thank you so much for being with us today and just sharing some wisdom about the world of strategic planning and fundraising and
Yeah.
like I said, it's truly an honor to get a front row seat at that work. And I have gleaned some things. Maybe I can go back and join a Girl Scouts now after having.
There you go. It's not too late for you. You can read the
Why
paper
not?
and sell cookies. Those are the two things. So no, listen, it's such a pleasure, and you're doing amazing work. I mean, it's mutual admiration society over here. I've been so blessed by the opportunity to work with you and all this, and look forward to everything else you're going to accomplish with this.
Oh, you're sweet. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us.
All right.
And we'll see you next time.